Hey everyone, Meredith here. So, a few days ago, I posted something on what it looks like to love our enemies and some thoughts that I've been having around that. And really, the gist of it is, it's not that it means that we have to want everything great for them. It means that we pray that God would show up in their lives in a way that would bring out their best, and that might not always feel good at first, but we want God to move people in the right direction. Well, I've also been thinking about, what does it mean to love our neighbors? And I read recently in the Gospel of Luke the interaction that Jesus has where he's talking with a teacher of the law, and they talk about the greatest commandments. And it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And this teacher of the law wants to justify himself, so he turns to Jesus and says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And many of us are familiar with that story of where there's a random person who gets robbed and beaten, and two people who should stop, two religious people who should stop don't, and then the Samaritan, who's like the bad guy, stops, takes care of this guy, brings him to the inn, pays for his wounds and his needs and all of that stuff. And what's interesting is the story is started with the question, well, who is my neighbor, right? But Jesus actually flips it. If you read the story, he actually flips the answer, which he always does. I mean, this is why I love Jesus, because I always say he doesn't tell you what to think, he teaches you how to think. And he answers the question differently. He doesn't say, well, this is who your neighbor is. His answer, because he poses the question back to the guy, well, who then was a neighbor? And he reluctantly says, well, the Samaritan, because nobody wants the Samaritan to be the good guy in the story, but the Samaritan. And Jesus says to him, go and do likewise. And what that really makes me think, and sometimes we miss this, is we ask the question, well, who do I have to love? Who's my neighbor? Who counts? Is it someone who's from a different political party, someone of a different race, of a different class, sexual orientation, whatever that is, who's in, who's out? And rather than answering that question of, well, who do I have to love? Jesus says, he doesn't say, who is your neighbor? He tells that person to go and be a neighbor. Go and be a neighbor. And that's a little bit different. Rather than saying, well, who do I have to love? Jesus says, you should be a loving person. You should be the neighbor to everyone. Rather than figure out who is your neighbor, you be the neighbor. And so it just makes me wonder, what does it look like, rather than wondering, who is my neighbor? Who do I have to love? How do I love someone who's different than me? And do they count? And instead asking, what does it look like for me to be a neighbor to every person that I encounter? How do I go and do likewise? How do I meet people's needs? How do I go above and beyond? How do I be someone who expresses the love of Jesus that he has for every person, regardless of where they're at? And so the question for all of us is, what does it look like for you to be a neighbor? And I wonder what that sparks for you today.